Real estate's going to crash. Why? I don't know, but it's going to crash. I'm going to show you some evidence that kind of surprised me. It's very interesting if you do some research. You might see that you just don't know. So let's hang in there. Hold on just a sec. Quite surprised what I found. I went into this with the idea that as the interest rates went up, the value of the homes in the United States would go down. And so I figured there'd be for sure a decline in the price of homes in the 70s simply because the mortgage rates are going up, which meant to buy a home via a loan would be more and more expensive. And then the 80s, the interest rates were quite high to start with. And then they started to drop rather significantly in the latter part of the 80s. I figured that would be it would be sure indicative of an increase in real estate prices. And then the 90s and obviously the 2010s. And what I found was not that at all. It's very, very interesting, actually. So we're going to look at three things. We're going to look at the price of mortgages. All right. We're going to look at the value of residential real estate prices throughout the United States, not just specific to your community, but throughout the U.S., because that's what everyone has to contend with who's looking at this. Say, look, I live in St. Louis. I live in Marietta, Georgia. I live here. I mean, you got to look at the U.S. as a whole. What are you doing? Fanny, get down, please. And then we're going to look at the increase in wages as well. All three of these things they flow together. And what you're going to come up with is just you cannot sit there and extrapolate any proven data set that says what's going to happen going forward. You just don't know. It's nuts. And anyone that says they don't, they just don't know what they're talking about. All right, so first thing we're going to look at the Fed. And the first thing we're going to do is going to look at residential real estate prices going back to what happened? Okay. We're going to go back to 1970. That's weird. Yeah, residential real estate prices, 1970, right there. And we're going to go to 1980. All right, so 1980, right there. All right, so what you're going to see is we start the index at 61, and then we end it at the end of that decade at 81. All right, so 61 to 81, that's a 32% increase in residential real estate over the course of that decade, 32%. Which is weird. I thought it'd be going down simply because, as you can see here, this is a 30-year mortgage rate. The interest rates went from 7.3 at the beginning of the decade to basically about twice that at the end of the decade. So we had a doubling of interest rates in the 1970s, and we had a 32% increase in price of housing, which is weird. I just thought that was odd. Because of how can the price of housing go up when the affordability of houses goes down because interest rates? Well, then I saw this right here, which is going to be the wages, the wage index, and you'll see the wages went from 545 in February 1970 to 1321 in January 1980. So that's the inflation right there. So we had a 143% increase in wages. All right, so the interest rates go up, make the housing for people who are borrowing less affordable. But that is offset by an inflationary with the wages going up. So that meant that in 1970s, the price of homes jumped by higher than any other decade from 1978 in my lifetime, the last 50 years. The increase in wages offset the increase in interest rates, if that makes sense, which was odd to me. I mean, it makes sense, but I said, oh, okay. So price of housing did go up, but not nearly to the extent as the price of your income. Even though interest rates are going up. That seemed counterintuitive to me again. Interest rates go up, I would have thought the price of houses go down. All right, so let's look at the 1980s. All right, so we look at the 1980s. And again, the 80s, we start with basically 13% interest rate. We end the 80s with a basic 10% interest rate. So a 30% decline in the price of your mortgage, all right? 30% decline in how much it costs to borrow money. All right, so here we go to 1980. And we go to 1990 to get a gauge of what the residential real estate was. We started with 82 basically in 1980, and we end with 94 in 1990. So we have a 16% increase in residential real estate. Not much at all, which is odd because, again, inflation was pretty high in the 80s. It wasn't 70s-ish, but it was still pretty high. But we only had a 16% increase in residential real estate prices, even though interest rates went, well, again, from 13 roughly in 1980 to about, about 10, in 1990. So interest rates dropped by 30% and residential real estate went up only by 16%, and yet wages went up by a doubling. With a doubling of wages. Finnegan, come here. Come here. Oh boy, this guy. Puppies. What are you doing there, big boy? We had a doubling of wages from 1980, 1321 to 2651. We had a doubling of wages. So wages doubled, interest rates dropped by 30%, and price of houses only went up by 16%. That seems completely just odd to me. Wages go up by twice, and interest rates go down, and the price of real estate only increases by and the price of real estate only increases by 16%. Interesting. All right, so let's keep going. Let's look now at the 90s. So we start the 90s right here, about 10% or so. We end the 90s at about 8. So we've dropped by, what's that, a 20% decline in interest rates, right? Or 25%. Yeah, 20% decline in interest rates. 25% decline in interest rates. We have a 25% decline in interest rates, and yet we go to real estate prices. I just gave the puppies a bath. Well, Pablo's not a puppy, but Finney is. And he's like, I love my baths. And we go from an index of 94 to the end of 95. So basically we had a 1% increase in the price of houses in the 1990s. Yet interest rates fell by 25%. Housing costs only went up by 1%. And yet labor, your wages went up by 80%. It's weird, man. I don't get it. None of this should happen. And you can see right here, we go here, the ending labor at the end of 1990 was 4,700. At the beginning of 1990 was 2,600. So you have an 80% increase in wages, all right? A 25% decrease in the mortgage costs, and only a 1% increase in property values. Is that mass building? I have no idea. It's interesting to me. Is that because of immigration? Makes it cheaper for homes? Maybe massive amounts of immigration. I don't know, but it's interesting. All right, so now we go to 2000. So let's go to 2000, and we say boink, boink. We go there, and you'll see in 2000 we go from 95 to 102. That's only a 7% increase in residential real estate. That's it, 7%. And yet you can see the interest rates go from basically 7.5 down to right there, about 5 or so. Yeah, about 5. So they go down another 30% or so. And yet wages in the 2000s go, let's go here, boink. Right there to 2010. Wages go from, oops, start right there. Come on, man. Blink, blink, blink. All right, right there. They go from 4,700 to 6,200, which is an increase of 25%. So wages increased by 25%. Interest rates dropped by about 30%. And the residential real estate only goes up by 7%. Weird, man. Weird. And then finally go to the aughts. Hear that dog? I love it. And we're going to say what we're looking at here. All right. So the increase in labor, the cost of your wages went up by 54%. And yet the residential real estate, Finney, trying to do a video, buddy. Actually, doesn't bother me. Some people, I don't like your dog on the video. I frankly don't care. All right, residential real estate went from 102 to 134. So we basically got a 30% increase in residential real estate. Yet the interest rates and inflation were way down. We got we have 5% at the end of 2009, and then we have a freaking 2.7% at the end of 2020 for a 30-year fixed. So wages go up by 54%. Rates go down by 50%. So wages go up by 54. Interest rates go down by 50%. And yet the price of houses goes up by 29%, which is the second high on record for these 5 years, for the 5 decades. But 29% increase in residential real estate isn't huge. It's just not over 10 years. In fact, if you look, the real estate increase is only averaged 1.55% a year going back to 1970. I mean, it's crazy. So look, if we go back here to residential real estate, and we go back to boink, boink. What are you doing over there, big boy? All right, we'll go here. All right, we start right here at 60, and we end right here at 134. That's a 1.55% increase annualized in residential real estate. So there's no way we have interest rates declining in the right here. Residential real estate goes up by 29%. Interest rates increasing right here. Residential real estate goes up by 32%. Labor costs, or not the cost, but the salaries, the wages goes up by 143% in the 70s right here, and salaries go up only by 54% in the teens. So inflation in the 70s is huge. Inflation in the teens is nothing. How do you attribute any of this? How can you say because of this number we're going to have a huge increase in residential real estate or a market crash? You can't. There's no correlation that leads one to come to a conclusion that if such thing happens, that will happen. You can't make that an argument. You could say globalization. Well, globalization, we were in globalization in the teens in this last decade. That still gave us the second highest increase in residential real estate. You could say also unlimited blue collar or unskilled immigration. Well, we still had an increase in the teens and even in the aughts. The second highest, well, I guess not the second, 7.3% of the aughts. That's still increased. Now, I don't know what you attest that to. In the 90s, we only had a 1% increase. Are you saying there wasn't huge amounts of immigration in the 90s? Of course there was. Are you saying there wasn't globalization in the 90s? Of course there was. Did that lead to residential real estate prices not moving? I don't know. We had globalization. We still had globalization in the teens, and yet we had residential real estate increasing the second highest of these 5 decades. We had globalization in the 90s. Residential real estate only increased by 1%. We still had unmitigated immigration in the teens. Residential real estate increases by the second highest in the 90s. The second highest in the teens, and we still had unmitigated immigration for cheap labor and increased by 1% in the 90s. With interest rates declining on both decades, and residential real estate, one went flat, one went up. It's crazy. In the 70s, finally, hold on a second. And then in the 70s, we had a huge increase in interest rates, huge increase in your labor, your salary, and we had high inflation. But residential real estate only increased by 32% in the 70s. So I don't know what to make of that. So when I hear these people say, "Oh my goodness, real estate's about to crash," we don't know. It's okay to say I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know. Will residential real estate crash? I have no clue. You have no clue. No one has any clue. Will inflation come up? We have no clue. None of this stuff is factual. There is no correlation between this data set and that data set. I just proved it. Yeah, love to hear your thoughts. All right, we'll see you.